Hello, this is Pam Hall, and this is Earth News. Today's guest is Carol Sullivan from Moms Demand Action. And Carol, I have some questions for you. Who is Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America?
So we're one of the country's largest gun violence prevention organizations. We are the volunteer grassroots arm of an organization called Everytown for Gun Safety. That larger Everytown organization encompasses Moms Demand Action, Mayors Against Illegal Guns, and the Everytown Survivor Network. And together, we're over 5 million Americans strong, mothers and others. We're not just moms. So we're concerned citizens who believe that there are common sense measures that can be taken to prevent and reduce gun violence.
Okay. Be Smart is the organization's main educational program.
Yep.
Can you talk about what that program tries to get across?
Sure. The SMART is actually an acronym, and I'll run through it a little bit. The S stands for securing your guns responsibly in vehicles and homes. The M stands for modeling responsible gun behavior, right? We really want to make sure that guns are not toys, playing with them is not a game. The A in SMART stands for asking others about the presence of unsecured firearms, be that in homes or vehicles of your own, your relatives, where you're going to drop your kids off for play dates. The R stands for recognizing risks. Recognizing the risks of the presence of guns when it comes to being at risk for suicide. And especially the focus there is on teens, because this is an overall program geared for parents of youth and youngsters. And lastly, the T in SMART stands for telling others about it. We really want to take the taboo out of having any conversation about guns, right? Especially here in Michigan, chances are someone's either living in a home with guns, or you're going to have a relative that has them for hunting, sport, what have you, some self-defense. Take the taboo out of having it and just say, hey, you know, my little Joey is really curious, gets into all the drawers and things like that. Do you have firearms at home? Oh, okay. Do you keep them locked up? And if they do, great. And if not, you know, maybe you can suggest another place to have that play date or something. But the Be Smart program is something that is national, and even here in our local group in the Great Lakes Bay region, we've got awesome trained facilitators that can do a presentation as short as 20 minutes or as long and robust a program with Q&A, and we've had our community resource officer join us for a 90-minute program. We're always looking for new audiences to get that message out in front of, and we're open for new audiences to be brought to our attention, so we can do that. Those trained facilitators are great. They're 20-year competitive skeet shooters. They really have good credibility.
I've been to several of the meetings, Carol, and they do an excellent job.
Yeah. Yeah.
So thank you for the awareness in the community.
You know, it's last point on the Be Smart program and the even just taking those actions, those SMART actions, it's probably the easiest and safest thing anyone can do, right, around youngsters to prevent gun violence and prevent teen suicide.
Right, and it's so simple, but a lot of people don't think of that. They don't think of checking for firearms, but they want to make sure that there is nothing that child may be allergic to and so forth, but that they forget to check on that, and that is important, because like you said, kids are curious.
Kids are curious, or people are afraid to bring it up. And again, the T, it's not official. The official T is tell others about the program. Mm-hmm. I like to add, take the taboo out of having the conversation.
Right. Mm-hmm. So in early August, back-to-back mass shootings in El Paso and Dayton renewed debate on whether or not buying or carrying military-style assault rifles should be legal. What does Moms Demand Action have to say about banning these types of weapons?
Well, to be sure, military-style assault rifles increase the lethality of any shooting, okay? They're going to increase the devastation of the type of injuries in any kind of shooting that involves those weapons. However, I think perspective is important here. Mass shootings with these type of weapons, especially in public places, get the vast majority of major media coverage, but they only represent less than 3% of all gun violence in America. So Moms Demand Action's official position is not, they would not oppose any ban, but we're never going to prioritize it because we prioritize better vetting of the who. Better vetting of who gets to access any type of firearm, because firearms other than those military-style assault rifles account for 97% of America's gun violence. So things like background checks and red flag laws are really our best tools right now to get at that vetting of the who behind the gun.
Right, and we had that, and it's something that we need to get again, and a lot of states differ on this. It would be nice if there was a national policy. I know Mom's been working very hard at state level, local level, and we had some good laws before, and we just need to really look at that and reinstate those things. You mentioned background checks. Some folks say we already have background checks, so why do we need more? And others say background checks only inconvenience responsible gun owners. Can you speak to these concerns?
Yeah, so on that second point, I always like to say, you know, how do you establish the responsible gun owners from the irresponsible gun owners? And part of that is the vetting process that happens in a background check, right? The background check is there to flag people who federal law already says are prohibited from purchasing, possessing, or receiving a firearm. And, you know, I'm not going to get into all the categories, but we're talking about criminal felons convicted of anything over a year or more of jail time, drug abusers, convicted domestic abusers. If you're not in the U.S. Legally, right, there are others. But why do we need them? Why are we talking about background checks, right? No, don't we have them? A lot of states have closed the most common loophole in the background check system, and that is what's referred to as either the online and gun show loophole or essentially the private seller loophole. When background checks were first enacted, largely spearheaded by the Brady campaign in the early 90s, when it went into effect, it applied only to firearms bought through federally licensed dealers. And, you know, kind of shopping more at your brick and mortar stores, let's say. And I think, Pam, let me ask you this. In the last, like, even just 5 years or so, how much more shopping have you done at brick and mortar stores versus online?
Well, yeah.
Yeah. And the same is true with firearms, right? A lot of folks are ordering online from private sellers, right? And there are many more transactions done that way, even with firearms. And those, unless you live in a state that has closed that background check loophole, there is no requirement for a background check when that transaction is executed between a private seller and a buyer. So if I'm a prohibited purchaser, right, I'm that convicted felon, I'm that convicted domestic abuser, I'm the person who's mentally ill, I can skirt the background check system and just arrange for the transaction through Facebook, armslist.com, okay, find myself a private seller who's not going to do it, and there I go. Michigan partly closes it. If it's a handgun, you have to then go through the CPL process, and so the background check is partly there. But if I wanted to buy a rifle here in Michigan, and I'm a prohibited purchaser, I don't have to go through a background check.
See, that's what I'm talking about, having common sense, you know, which
Right.
is in the name of what you have.
Right.
And that, yeah.
Yeah, and the point about, you know, will it inconvenience, you know, someone who's like, boy, I just want to, this is how I want to do my shopping. I want to buy from a private seller. There are more, so the way it would be executed if it became law, that person buying the firearm and the seller, that transaction would have to be executed at the nearest federally licensed shop, right? So the local Ace Hardware might be an example. And places like that are all over the state. Mm-hmm. There are more federally licensed dealers than there are Starbucks and McDonald's in America combined. So it's really not too much of an inconvenience.
Right. Well, I know a lot of people that I've spoken with get really defensive when you talk about, you know, gun safety, and they're not the ones that need to be concerned. So, like you said, bringing the conversation out for people to understand that responsible gun owners aren't aren't really who we're addressing right now.
Right, and this is one of the measures that has 90% of the support from the American public. You know, a little poll variance here and there, but I mean, it's hard to get 90% of Americans to agree on anything. And all we're asking is for individual rights,
Right.
like gun ownership, like carrying in public, to be balanced with public safety.
Exactly. Okay, so you mentioned red flag legislation that's gained a lot of traction at the state level since Parkland, Florida massacre at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. 5 states, including Indiana, have red flag laws before February 2018. A year and a half later, 17 states have passed some type of red flag law extreme risk protection order measure. What do these measures do?
So red flag legislation is sort of a catch-all term to describe laws that are often called extreme risk protection acts or extreme risk protection order acts. And it's like what it sounds like. There are a lot of folks who will say this is just a mental health problem. If we deal with the mentally ill or prohibit the mentally ill from having guns, we're going to be in a lot better shape. The issue is there are a lot of folks who we learn later, right after these tragedies happen, they didn't have what would be a diagnosed mental illness. They experienced something much more acute in a temporary, or I'm sorry, a finite time frame, right? Rage or depression or being irate after being terminated from employment or the breakup of a relationship, right? These are people who go about their normal school life or work life or everyday life, but some finite moment erupts in a temporary mental crisis, a temporary breakdown. No bones about that. But these are things that would not put them on a prohibited purchaser list. But they are things that loved ones close to someone, close to that individual, loved ones, roommates, family members, would say, something's wrong. You know, something is wrong here. I see red flags. And the way the legislation would work, the devil's in the details. And for sure, a good red flag law has to be written with robust due process protections. And the Michigan proposed bill does have it. It would say we're going to select people immediately close to that individual. It varies across the states, but in general, it's immediate family members or household members or law enforcement, right, for someone who lives by themselves. And we're going to allow them to petition a judge. So there'd be an adjudicated process where a judge is presented with evidence to say, okay, this person presents an imminent risk to themselves or others, and yes, guns need to be removed from their possession, or they need to be put on a list where they're prohibited from purchasing. Now, many states that have enacted red flag measures, that adjudicated process can happen ex parte, meaning the person, the individual in question, does not have to be present. But that's for the immediate action, right? Let's remove the immediate danger. What must happen afterwards, and again, this varies state by state, whether it's within 7 days or 14 days or 30 days, a full hearing with that individual present must be offered to that individual. And there is the due process protection. And the judge then decides, okay, we extend this period of temporary removal, and we'll revisit it in 1 year. This is seen by a lot of folks on the conservative side, as being a far less drastic measure than getting someone involuntarily committed to remove a firearm. So in that respect, it's seen as a plus, and why a lot of conservatives back red flag laws. And the last thing is that you build in penalties for false or frivolous claims, so that an ex or someone who just doesn't like someone or wants to have someone go through a tough time doesn't just say, oh yeah, I'd like to petition for this ERPA order. You know, if it's a false or frivolous claim, there'd be serious penalties. So all that's part of red flag legislation.
Right. It's very detailed, like you said, and the adjudication is really helpful.
Yep.
So Michigan is not one of the 17 states with a red flag law. Is there anyone in Lansing working on this?
Yeah, so actually there are companion bills in both Lansing State House and State Senate. We've actually seen some recent developments in the news. There was actually a red flag bill proposed in Lansing before Parkland, before that Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School shooting in February 2018. And as you mentioned, a ton of state energy has focused on this. 12 additional states have enacted red flag measures after the 5 that had it before Parkland. Michigan's not one of them. We hear that Dems are talking to Republicans on this. Right now, up until now, Republicans have buried it and not even allowed a committee hearing on it. And we have hopes that Republican leadership will allow a committee on red flag legislation after the budget process is done. So we're hopeful for maybe sometime later in October.
That would be great.
It would be a start.
Okay, so are there any other statewide bills related to smarter, stronger gun legislation that Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense is supporting?
Yeah, so there's actually a bill around domestic violence or domestic abusers and access to guns that's been introduced now a couple years, or a couple legislative cycles in a row by a Republican woman representing a district north of here. I think it's the 103rd district, but don't quote me on that. But her name is Diare Rendon, and when she introduced it earlier this cycle, she had 2 other Republicans join her and 11 Democrats join her. So actually this has got a lot of co-sponsors, and the nature of the bill has 2 main objectives. One is to tackle the fact that without a comparable state law, the federal prohibition against convicted domestic abusers and access to firearms, it can only be addressed by federal agents, meaning a local Michigan cop or a state trooper doesn't have any jurisdiction. They could maybe go to a home of a known convicted domestic abuser. Maybe it's a drug charge, maybe it's loud noise at a party, but they notice that there is a firearm in the possession of someone who should not have it. They cannot act. They have to call an ATF agent up, and the likelihood of that being reported, we have been told by the top ATF agent in the state, that likelihood is small, that it's even reported. And then, of course, it doesn't make time, it doesn't respect time sensitivity, right? And the ATF hasn't seen an increase in its workforce since the 1970s, so they're just spread too thin.
Right.
So Representative Rendon's bill would close that loophole by saying we're going to make a comparable law on Michigan's books so that Michigan law enforcement can act.
Right.
And the second part is they would say right now that federal law only applies to intimate partners who are spouses or live with. And unfortunately, I think it's half of all the domestic violence homicides are committed by non-spouses, right? Dating partners that don't necessarily live with the person, or stalkers. And so the bill would look to expand it to that category.
That's why you said before that's just a start when I said that's good what's happening in October, because there's more work to be done.
Yeah. I mean, there is bipartisan support already for that domestic abuse bill. October is National Domestic Abuse Awareness Month.
Right.
We'd love for that conversation to be a focus of Lansing's as well.
Yeah, it would be great. And realizing it might change by the time the show airs, what's going on at the federal level?
Yeah, so actually, Senate resumed, the U.S. Senate resumed from their summer recess right after Labor Day, or the week after. And I know that some of the Democratic senators had a sit-in, took the floor and shared some powerful stories. Caught in a little bit of a delay game, Republican Senate, obviously they control the Senate, and Senate leadership has said, well, we're waiting to hear what the president will sign. And you've got the president who's not being clear about what kind of measure he will sign. So we know how this game has played out in past years. They punt, they kick it down the road, and they wait for something else to take hold of the news cycle. It's on us, it's on concerned citizens, whether you're affiliated with a gun violence prevention group or not, to make sure your volume of voices are heard and to keep attention on this. Continue to follow up with your legislators. I honestly don't know how it's going to go. But where conservatives seem a little bit more amenable to red flag legislation, they actually had hearings on that earlier this year. It's good to point out that it really loses teeth unless you have an expanded background check system, unless you do something like universal background checks and include private sellers, because any red flagged person can skirt the existing background check system by going through a private seller.
Yeah.
So you really need both.
Mm-hmm. So I feel like there's a little bit of, if not now, when, to this current moment. What happens if nothing meaningful gets passed at the federal or state levels this cycle?
Well, I would hope that we do get something passed, but we do know that there's a likelihood that gridlock will prevent it, right? That in divided government or in the state level, Republican-controlled government, that they're not going to hear their constituents. And it's a shame. It shouldn't be a hard vote when 90% of Americans want something like this. It was helpful when the CEOs of 145 major companies, major retailers and others came out and not just changed some store policies with respect to open carry, but also sent a letter to Congress to not just do something, but to be very specifically asking for action around background checks and red flag laws. Now, if that doesn't happen, I would expect that, and I would ask folks to make gun violence prevention a top voting priority. The same kind of things that happened in electoral results in the midterms in 2018 with healthcare as a priority, allowed that to still be a viable thing for Americans. Moms Demand Action and Everytown have a great resource site. It's called gunsensevoter.org, gunsensevoter.org, where you can look up and see which of the candidates in any given race, plug in your zip code, you'll see the races closest to you. You can see who has aligned with some gun sense priorities. Now, the 2020 candidates, a lot haven't declared for some state and local races, so that website will be a better resource once we get into 2020.
Mm-hmm. Well, before I ask the last question, I just had a couple of comments so that when New Zealand had their mass shooting, immediately that country changed its gun laws, and other countries have acted sooner than the United States. This is my personal observation, and I've heard others at Moms speak this. I'm not sure exactly what Mom's stance is on this, but it seems like that the gun manufacturers and lobbyists are making the politicians beholden to them when they donate campaign money.
Yeah, there's certainly, whether it's from a gun lobby, manufacturers, leadership of organizations like the NRA, who don't always reflect what their members' positions are. That skews political debate, without a doubt. Wish there was a heck of a lot less money in politics, for sure. I'll say one thing about, I'll take an example of Michigan state legislature, right? You do have some of those folks in some of the more, the redder districts, right? Some of those folks might actually believe what we believe, but they are worried about losing their jobs getting primaried from the right, okay? And that's more of an issue than money pouring in from an outside source. I wish they would vote closer to their heart, right? But they're putting job over the right thing, some of them. Others they're part of the 10%, unfortunately. There are folks in the Michigan state legislature who are part of the 10% who really don't believe that we need expanded background checks, that it is an inconvenience, right? Or that don't see the necessity of a red flag law. So there's some of that as well.
I remember seeing the Parkland students actually putting a dollar sign on is your freedom to have a gun worth X amount of dollars for the life of this person that was lost. Right? Yeah. So how can folks learn more or get more involved with Moms Demand Action?
Sure. So there are a lot of good national websites. The MomsDemandAction.org is the website for the national organization. Our local group doesn't have a website, but we have a local contact email, and that is GLBR, Moms Demand gmail.com. The GLBR stands for our region, Great Lakes Bay region. Our membership covers a lot of Midland, Bay City, Saginaw, and Mount Pleasant areas.
Okay.
Yeah. And folks are welcome to come to our meetings. You know, the Moms Demand Action site has a little events tab where you can see events or meetings closest to where you are. But we've got a lot of folks who keep a pulse through us. They're not necessarily meeting goers or event goers, and that's okay too. I mean, the biggest thing we want to do is raise awareness of gun violence prevention as something that can be helpful. There are law enforcement tools out there. There are responsible storage tools out there that can make a real difference. This doesn't have to be a throw up your hands and this is our new normal. It doesn't have to be, not at all.
Right, and looking at, again, at what other countries have implemented that works, and protecting the Second Amendment rights. It's not about, as you've stated, Moms Demand Action supports the Second Amendment rights. Many members of Moms, own guns. It's about responsible gun ownership and
Pam,
common sense.
Thank you. Actually, this was
safety.
something I had wanted to answer when you first said, all right, who is Moms Demand? I want to be clear. Our local group has both gun owners and gun violence survivors. If they're not gun owners, they probably grew up in a home with guns. Our gun violence survivors have lost loved ones to a variety of gun violence, right? Everything from suicide to community violence, homicide, to losing a loved one in a domestic violence incident, right? And that's just in our local group alone. So having said that, between the gun owners, the gun violence survivors, I think the majority of our group are actually just concerned citizens who, again, believe that there are common sense measures to be taken that still respect the Second Amendment. Individual views in our group are always going to vary. I'm sure there are some people who are complete pacifists and would love to flush every gun down the toilet, but I know we have others who go out hunting or who carry, if not carry, maybe own a firearm for self-defense. But those don't, that experience doesn't preclude them from knowing that we can have stronger, smarter, safer gun laws.
We've had gun violence problems before all these mass shootings. Did you want to speak a little bit to that? The majority of the gun violence isn't from the mass shootings that is headlining the news.
I think
the suicides and the
2/3 of gun violence incidents in America are suicides, are firearm suicides. And even if you take that 1/3 of other accidental and homicide and police shootings, right, all rolled up, the vast majority of those happen in community gun violence, everyday incidents, concentrated neighborhoods of certain cities. But there is a ramification to the increase that has been increasing, but it's still just a small slice of gun violence. The increase of mass shootings in public places, right? Less than 3% overall of gun violence incidents in our country, but look at the ramifications. You've got kids practicing active shooter drills, trying to decide how they can throw their skateboard most effectively at someone coming at them with an AR-15. You've got well-intentioned folks directing resources at hardening schools, when by and large, in any community, in any state in America, school is still the safest place to be for kids. There was something, I hope I have the reference right, but since Parkland, so in the last year and a half or so, out of all school-age children that have died by firearm violence, half were by parents. Were their own parents who killed their kids in a murder-suicide incident. Okay? Schools being hardened is not necessarily the answer. And money, I'll give another example, a lot of talk right now about buyback programs. That is an extremely expensive proposition. Constitutional challenges aside, a buyback program is really costly. And I would think if I'm living in a community, maybe a Pontiac, a Detroit, maybe some parts of Saginaw, I would love for that those dollars to be better allocated towards what's really shown to prove to make a difference: community-based violence intervention programs, hospital-based violence intervention programs, right? That really break a pattern of revenge, shootings and killings, right? That really makes a difference. You want to bring gun violence numbers down? Focus there. Right?
Yeah, education and also opportunities and helping those that are marginalized people groups with jobs and dealing with the addictions and so forth.
Absolutely.
What is Mom's position on bump stock?
Yeah, so actually that was one of the things we were very glad to see the federal government make a decision on when, I forget if it was the White House administration or Department of Justice, but when they finally got around, it took a long time coming after the Las Vegas incident, but they did finally make bump stocks illegal. It's sort of in the same along the same lines as an assault weapons ban. There are a lot of things that we're going to support, but we're going to continue to prioritize the who, vetting who has access to any type of firearm. Because if you craft legislation that gets at a specific device or a specific firearm, almost the next day you can count on manufacturers to make one modification, and now all of a sudden, you've got something that's outside of the spec of the given law. So we're not going to necessarily oppose those things, but we're going to prioritize vetting measures.
How do you handle someone that's commenting the best way to protect someone that from someone that has a gun is to have a gun yourself?
I would say go and do the research. We are not out to say owning a gun is for or against, is in your best interest or not. You have to make that personal decision. I've got an uncle who's a former DA. He is a firearm carrier, right, because he put a lot of bad dudes in jail, as he likes to say, that don't always stay in jail. That is a personal decision. But we would say, for yourself and for your family, take a look, weigh it out on the scale. Will that firearm make you safer or as safe as you think? I am sure that there might have been people carrying at that Las Vegas concert. They never expected someone to shoot from the floor of a nearby hotel with the kind of capacity and velocity that murderer shot with. No firearm on somebody's body was going to keep them safe that night, right? In a home with a teenager that's maybe going through a rough patch, make a good family decision about whether that teenager has access to the gun safe, or how will you make sure that they're always supervised if they go out hunting, right? Just in case. Have the conversation. That will eliminate a lot of tragedies.
And following up on that and speaking with the police, I've found that when people buy a firearm thinking, they're going to not only protect themselves, that they may engage if they see a shooting and protect others, there's actually quite a bit of limitation to what you can do if you have your own personal...
Yeah, one thing that law enforcement will often remind folks of is that, the one advantage that the irresponsible gun owner, the one looking to do harm, the one advantage they will always have over anyone else is the element of surprise, the element of acting first. And again, I mentioned our Be Smart trainers. They're 20-year competitive skeet shooters. One of them went through a Bay City's public safety it was a little live situation where there's a live action firearm exchanged, and again, this 20-year experienced target shooter was not able to react with any accuracy before the bad guy with the gun got him first. Again, I think we skew the conversation if we think about all right, who would be better in that situation? Data shows that. Let's not go down the data rabbit hole. Let's look at the Dayton shooting. Mm-hmm. Law enforcement was on the scene within 30-something seconds, and there were still multiple fatalities and injuries, right? So trained law enforcement, folks who know what it's like to be able to act in a controlled manner, even though your adrenaline and heart rate are pumping, and they still couldn't prevent loss of life and limb, right? Everything was reactionary. Were some lives saved? Sure. But we're talking about preventing it in the first place. I just don't understand why a lot of folks who are all about law and order are constantly just reacting to illegal activity. Let's try and prevent it from happening in the first place.
And that's why I keep bringing up like the concealed carry permit, because a lot of people that right away you talk about gun safety and they get defensive. Their reaction is that if you take away their gun, they're not going to be able to jump in and help. But as you just pointed out, trained officers that aren't just pulling it out every once in a while, they're practicing shooting on a regular basis, are having they're challenged in those moments.
And again, but I think watch the framing of it. I mean, no one is out to take guns away from responsible gun owners. Right. We're talking about measures that background checks. Let's vet the responsible gun owners away from the irresponsible ones, the prohibited purchasers, and red flag laws, which would kind of close the gap between the folks who are, known prohibited purchasers, diagnosable mentally ill, and those who are experiencing an acute moment of rage, depression, what have you.
Right.
Yeah.
Because the vigilante laws do exist, and people, if they have a concealed weapons permit, it doesn't give them just free range to jump in and engage with whatever. There's legalities and
absolutely.
And
I mean, you gotta, if you own a firearm, I've got a friend who likes to remind folks, if you own a firearm, you have to be prepared to reconcile with yourself that you might kill someone. You have to be ready to wrestle with that. And law enforcement will remind folks that, boy, you better be sure with how you act in a given circumstance. And in an active shooter situation, if law enforcement arrives on the scene, think about this: public place of worship, church, grocery store. Law enforcement arrives and they see the good guy with a gun. The good guy with a gun drawn. They are going to shoot first and ask questions later. And so you are, the good guy with the gun potentially is putting themselves at risk of being targeted by law enforcement.
So an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
And amen to that, Pam.
All right. Well, thank you for being our guest today on Earth News.
Thanks, Pam.
And I am going to sign off now until next time. Thank you.
Can't grow without that precious link. Water is the key to life, it always needs to be. Above all else, our most protected legacy. We are one, we are water. Water is life. We are one. We are water. Water is life. Protect the water. Save our Great Lakes. save our city of Flint.